Verse 2 was an encouraging verse for the Corinthians. But verse 3 begins with "but," indicating that at least some within the church needed correction on a tradition that was becoming controversial. The controversial tradition, head coverings. Now in verse 3 to 6, the point that is being made may be summarized in these two sentences. Our respective heads are dishonored by wrong head covering practices, and we disgrace ourselves. Our respective heads are dishonored by wrong head covering practices, and we disgrace ourselves. Let me just talk about the first three words: our respective heads, our respective leaders. This comes from verse 3. Now before I read the verse, let me point out a translation error. The ESV translates wife instead of woman. Most other translations translate woman, and they are right. But I'll address this translation issue of whether it should be woman or wife, should be man or husband. I'll address it in a separate video because this translation error is found in other Bible passages also. So I'll just address it all together rather than individually. For now, I'll read woman instead of wife all throughout 1 Corinthians 11 verse 2 to 16. Okay, reading verse 3. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Okay, one step at a time. Man's head is Christ. Christ is the leader of every Christian man, and every Christian man is therefore under Christ's authority. Woman's head is man. Christian men are the leaders of every Christian woman. Therefore, every Christian woman is under the authority of Christian men. Last step. Christ's head is God. God is Christ's leader. Christ, the divine Son, is under God, the divine Father's authority. Now note that the divine Son is equal to the divine Father, and the divine Son submits himself under his divine Father's leadership. There's no conflict between the divine Son being equal to the Father and his role of submitting to his Father. He is equal, but he submits. And we see this equality and submission in John 5 verse 18 and 19. Let me take verse 18 first. Verse 18, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Jesus, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So Jesus, the divine Son, claimed to be and is indeed equal to his divine Father. He is as divine as the Father, and he has no problem submitting himself under his divine Father's leadership and authority, as seen from the very next verse, John 5 verse 19. So Jesus said to them, the Jews who would like to murder him, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. Verse 30 makes the same point. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me, the Father's will. So, although the divine Son is equal to the divine Father, yet he obediently submits to his Father's will in all things. Now, lest we think that this was only during Jesus' earthly ministry, and after he was raised from the dead, ascended on high, seated on the right hand of God, now he no longer has this submissive role to play anymore. No. Listen to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 24 to verse 28. And you'll notice how the Divine Son will submit to his Divine Father. Now, as I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 15, verse 24 to 28, instead of reading he or him throughout this passage, I'll read either the Son or the Father, so you know who is being referred to. Otherwise, it may be confusing. Since both the Son and the Father are male, he or him, you won't be able to tell just by, it will be a bit more confusing. So I'm just going to read the Son or the Father instead of he or him. And you see whether I got it correct or not. Then comes the end, when the Son delivers the kingdom to God the Father, after destroying every rule and every authority and power. For the Son must reign until the Father has put all the Son's enemies under the Son's feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. For the Father has put all things in subjection under the Son's feet. But when it says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that the Father is accepted, who put all things in subjection under the Son. When all things are subjected to the Son, then the Son himself will also be subjected to the Father, who put all things in subjection under the Son, that God the Father may be all in all. Now, you felt that was a bit confusing, just listen again and just have a think. But as we read these few verses, we notice that the Divine Son did not submit to his Father's leadership only during his earthly ministry. The event described here in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 24 and 28 is a future event, the end of time. You see, the Father assigned his Son the task of destroying every enemy. When that is completed at the end of time, the Son will hand over a kingdom cleansed of all enemies back to the Father. And then the Divine Son will once more submit himself to his Divine Father, so that his Divine Father may be all in all, publicly, unquestionably, ruling over all, including his Divine Son. So there is no contradiction where two equally, fully divine beings, Father, Son, there is no contradiction where two equally, fully divine beings have a hierarchical relationship, where the Father is the head and the leader of the equally, fully divine Son. Likewise, there is no contradiction, or there should be no contradiction, where two equally, fully human beings, man and woman, have a hierarchical relationship where man is the head and leader of woman. Okay. So God is a supreme head, supreme leader. Christ, man, and woman are all under his supreme authority. But under God's supreme headship, under his supreme leadership, under his supreme authority, he has delegated headship, leadership, and authority in ordered relationships, such that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. That's an order. Implications. Well, man's supreme head and leader is God, but God has delegated his authority to Christ as the head of every Christian man. So every Christian man also has another head and leader, a delegated leader, an immediate leader, Christ. So no Christian man can say, I recognize God as my head and leader and submit to his authority, but I don't recognize Christ as my head and leader, and I will not submit to Christ's authority. No Christian man can say that. We submit to God as supreme head that means you're going to submit to his delegated head, Christ. Okay, so woman's supreme head and leader is God. Christian women also no doubt recognize Christ as her head and leader. But God and Christ have delegated their authority to Christian men as head of Christian women. So, Christian woman also has another head and leader, a delegated leader, her immediate leader, Christian men. No Christian woman can say, I recognize God as my head and leader and submit to his authority. I also recognize Christ as my head and leader and submit to his authority. But I don't recognize Christian men as my head and leader, and I will not submit to the authority of Christian men. No Christian woman can say that. Paul wrote in verse 3, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Both Christian men and women have his and her own respective immediate head and leader.